Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Julian Hawthorne. I'm the son of the late Nathaniel Hawthorne, and my family purchased this house in 1852, along with 9 acres of land for $1,500. Upon purchasing the house, though, we made some structural changes. We added a 3-story tower onto the back of the house, culminating in what my father calls his Sky Parlor, which is his study. We also added on a 2nd story for my older sister, Una, to have a bedroom. We enclosed the porch and moved the barn to the east side of the house. Now, we believe that this house was built sometime in the 1600s, probably mid to late 1600s, as when the Whitneys stayed here, Mr. Samuel Whitney was the muster master of Concord. In 1775, they referred to it as their old home, and we believe it was about 100 years old at that point. Then, after the Whitneys stayed here, it passed through subsequent owners until it finally ended up with the Alcotts. And a good friend of theirs, Mr. Frederick Llewellyn Willis, would oftentimes come and spend the summers with them here. After the Whitneys lived here in 1775, Dr. John Winthrop moved into the house as Harvard College had to be moved to Concord during the American Revolution. So Dr. John Winthrop and his student, Benjamin Thompson, oftentimes would take careful scientific recordings of the weather and the comets while they were here. Now, after buying the house in 1852, we subsequently, the next year in 1853, had to depart for Liverpool, England, as my father was appointed the consul to Liverpool by his dear friend Mr. Franklin Pierce, after having written Pierce's campaign biography and after the election, his election to presidency. We stayed in Europe until 1860, and while we were in Europe, our cousins, the Manns, stayed here, and I'm sure you may have heard of Mr. Horace Mann, who's quite an educational reformer. Now, if you'll come on into the house, I'd like to show you some of the history of where I live and some of the characters and the young men that have come before me living in the Wayside at my house. Well, good afternoon, and I find it compelling to relate what these rooms have been used for in the past. Now, this room was originally half of a wheelwright's shed, which Mr. Bronson Alcott chopped in half when he bought the house in 1846. The other half he added to the opposite side of the house, and this was used as a room where the Alcotts would get ready in the mornings to go and work in their gardens. Now, the young Mr. Frederick Llewellyn Willis would have come and stayed here and gotten ready to work with the Alcott girls and Mr. Bronson Alcott in the mornings. Now, it was a very interesting meeting that he had with the Alcotts as he was on his way out to Harvard, Massachusetts at the age of 14 after becoming estranged from his grandparents, as his conviction of self and religious beliefs led him into an argument with his grandparents. And so he was out on his way to Harvard while the Alcotts were living at Fruitlands. And it just so happened that his finger got shut in the stagecoach door and he passed out. Now, luckily, Mrs. Alcott was there, and she ended up bringing him back to consciousness and promptly invited him over to visit with the Alcotts the next day. And he was an immediate natural fit for the family, and soon afterwards spent his summers with them here in Concord. Now, if you'll follow me into the next room, we're going to head into the kitchen. This room is our kitchen, and probably most likely where Benjamin Thompson would have visited his professor John Winthrop here in 1775. As Harvard was posted, I don't know if you know, in Concord during the American Revolution. Now, they would set up in taverns, pubs, restaurants around town, and Professor John Winthrop lived here at what we now call the Wayside, which my father named it after moving in Now, Bronson Alcott originally called this house the Hillside, as it is so close to the hill just over here, but my father thought it was much too close to the road, and so he renamed it Wayside. Getting back to Benjamin Thompson, though, and his professor John Winthrop, this is where he would have come and visited his professor and taken some scientific observations of the weather while they were here. Now, to move out to Concord, Professor Winthrop and his student, Mr. Benjamin Thompson, had to pack up the entire scientific libraries of Harvard in 2 days. And some of that was sent out, I believe, to Lowell, and the rest of it they brought out here, including one of Mr. John Winthrop's favorite possessions, his brass telescope that was given to him by a fellow from England. Now, my sisters and my mother, my sisters Una, my older sister, and Rose, my younger sister, and my mother Sophia often keep gardens out back here, and in fact we will have quite often a good harvest of strawberries, flowers, horseradishes, such things like this. Now, one evening we had quite an abundant harvest of horseradishes, and we brought them inside and cooked them up, got them ready for dinner. And my father took one bite of one of these horseradishes, and so did my little sister Rose, and both of them practically started fuming at the ears. They thought they were so hot. But I found nothing wrong with them, and so I ended up having a whole bowl of horseradishes for dinner that evening. Now, also out back brings back some memories of walking with Mr. Thoreau and my father, and we would oftentimes take the larch path up back, which my father designed to get into town. As you probably already know, if you're walking from town out to visit us, Mr. Bronson Alcott will oftentimes be sitting out front of their house, the Orchard House just down the road, and likes to engage people in philosophical discussions. Now, oftentimes these can last for hours, and so my father, if he had something to do, an appointment, he would often go around back on his larch path, hence avoiding Mr. Alcott and being able to get there on time. Now, Mr. Thoreau used to say that arrowheads would simply jump out of the ground for my father, as that was often a pastime of theirs to find Indian arrowheads out in the fields of Concord. Also, Mr. Thoreau taught us a fun trick where you roll up a leaf and can make a little trumpet out of it. And so I actually perfected this technique and had gotten very good one day and was practicing my trumpeting, but it turned out I'd taken a poison ivy leaf. And so I ended up with so much poison ivy all over my face the next morning that my little sister said I was barely recognizable as Julian Hawthorne. So if you'll follow me into the next room, we're going to head into my bedroom, and I'll tell you some more about that. Currently my bedroom, this is where the young Whitney men would have prepared their father, Mr. Samuel Whitney, for the American Revolution. Samuel Whitney was the muster master in Concord in 1775, when Dr. Prescott entrusted the news that the British regulars were coming to him. Subsequently, he had to wake up in the middle of the night and go and rouse the men of Concord to prepare for the morning. Now, his sons tried to join him, as I'm sure I would have in their place, but they were all stopped by their mother, Mrs. Abigail Whitney. Now, the Whitneys had to flee Concord, actually, literally under fire, and in fact, as they were heading out of Concord, a bullet came through their stagecoach, just barely missing the young Whitney boys and their mother, Abigail. However, now my bedroom, as you'll notice, it is on the first floor, as I have a little bit of a fear of fires, but I would also like to be able to get out of the house in the case of a fire and raise the alarm and be able to get my family out and protect them as well. My younger sister Rose, as I mentioned before, and my older sister Una as well. Although, don't tell my mother, but it does come in handy occasionally to leave very late at night or come back without being heard. I'm now attending Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm currently the #1 gymnast there, so I've been working very hard on that and having quite a good time as well. Now, my father, when he was at college up in Bowdoin in Maine, he met some of his good friends, Mr. Longfellow, who now lives in Cambridge as well, and Mr. Thoreau one time mentioned to Miss May Alcott and I that it was quite the sight to see the water lilies bloom down on the Concord River, and so one morning, the young Miss May Alcott tied a little string around her toe at night and put that out her window, and so I got up probably around 5:30, 5:45, I can't remember, and headed over and pulled on the string, and sure enough, down she came, and she was all in her best white Sunday dress, and was ready to go. So we went down to the Concord River, and we're out in a little skiff looking at the water lilies. But she's a bit of an artist and likes to sketch things and the like, and so not really knowing the etiquette of boats, she was sketching one of these water lilies and leaned over a little bit too far and maybe pulled on the water lily a little bit too hard. And so we both ended up in the river before we knew it and had to come running back to our houses before Concord awoke that morning for the Sunday service, we were sopping wet, and she ended up, her best white Sunday dress at that point then ended up being more her best brown Sunday dress. But there you are. Anyway, if you'll follow me into the next room, I'd like to point out what this room that was added on. This room is the dining room, and at this point I'd like to take the opportunity to speak a little bit more about Dr. John Winthrop, who, as I mentioned before, was a professor at Harvard in 1775 when Harvard was moved out to Concord. Now, he was actually the first American to lead a scientific expedition, which he did in 1761 to Newfoundland. Now, he chartered a boat up to Newfoundland so that he was able to observe Venus's transit. Now, being so far north, he was able to see Venus circumnavigate the pole on 360 degrees and hence get much better scientific observations. He was a dear friend of Mr. Benjamin Franklin, and it's often said that he could go into more depth and with more ingenuity than Franklin could, given the time and the resources. And in fact, it is due to his friendship with Benjamin Franklin that he was elected to the Royal Society of London after Franklin gave some of Mr. John Winthrop's lectures on Halley's Comet there. Now, he was incredibly diverse scientifically. He's known as the father of seismology. He did a lot of work on sunspots, experimental electricity. He worked with quite a lot. And he also went into cosmology and some geology even. Now, as I mentioned before, given the time and resources, he was often said to go beyond Mr. Benjamin Franklin, but their friendship did play a crucial role in their scientific observations. Now, my father has also had a great love of the outdoors and observing the outdoors and incorporating that into some of his writing. And in fact, he would often hike with his dear friend Mr. Herman Melville when we lived out in Lenox. And in fact, they named Mount Greylock, which, as you know, is the tallest mountain in Massachusetts, on one of their hikes. Now, I have a little letter here from my father speaking of his relationship with Melville, so I'm going to read a part of that. So it goes, "We took a pretty long walk together and sat down in a hollow among the sand hills, sheltering ourselves from the high cool wind, and smoked a cigar. Melville, as he always does, began to reason about providence and futurity and all that lies beyond human ken." So that gives you maybe an example of how my father and Melville would have interacted. Now, if you'll follow me, we're going to head up 3 stories to the Sky Parlor, which is the 3rd story of the tower that my father added on when we returned from Europe in 1860. This is my sister Una's bedroom, and you'll notice that it is one of the additions that we made to the house, as it has gabled arches over all the windows, which is characteristic, as I mentioned, of my father's Gothic writing style. Now you'll notice that this room is very much, quite a bit decorated in much lighter fashion than many of the other rooms in the house, as my sister Una has been having some troubles with her health. And so we hope that this room will maybe lighten her spirits a little bit. And she has been trying out this semi-new therapy which involves electric shocks, and so that's been quite an innovation, but it seems to be working fairly well for her. So I hope that she will be able to live a healthy life and will recover from this soon. This room is my father's Sky Parlor and study up here, and you'll notice over all the cupboards and windows there's a gabled arch effect. Now this is reminiscent both of my father's Gothic style of writing and some of the Italian villas that we saw while we were in Europe. Now you'll notice over here his stand-up writing desk is facing the wall, as he was oftentimes distracted by the outdoors, especially being in Concord, because there is so much traffic and so much excitement and people around, particularly with having 3 small children in the house as well. Now he found it to be almost a difficulty to write, and he would have to devote about 14 hours at a time to writing. So he would find it very hard to come and just write for a short amount of time. So you also know that it is a stand-up writing desk, which is characteristic of my father's writing desk that he had while he was in Salem at the Customs House there. And so he has modeled this desk after that, and it is also supposedly good for his health to be standing up, or it was good for his health to be standing up as he writes. Now, I do think that this room, though, would have been valued by some of the young men who have lived in the Wayside before my stay here. I believe that the Whitneys would have enjoyed this room and found it quite beneficial in their stay here in 1775 and preceding that up till 1769, as it would have provided a means to look out above the tree line and be able to maybe see more of what was happening in Concord and possibly raise the alarm better. I also think that Dr. John Winthrop and his student, Mr. Benjamin Thompson, would have enjoyed this room for its scientific value, as you are, again, able to see above the trees and would have been able to make better scientific observations with their telescopes and the like. And I do also think that the young Mr. Frederick Llewellyn Hovey Willis would have enjoyed this room as a place to get away and maybe contemplate on some of his religious thinking and his spirituality as well. Now, if you'll follow me down, we're going to go down to the parlor on the first floor. So we're going to watch your step as we head down, and we're going to head all the way down to the first floor. This room is my family's parlor, and this is where my mother will often invite the women of Concord over to have tea on Wednesday evenings and discuss current events, politics, this sort of thing. Oftentimes when my father was alive, though, we would also have the Alcotts over for dinner, and after we would play cards in here. And in fact, my little sister Rose will tell you that May Alcott and I would oftentimes sort of, one might say, change the rules a little bit. But as I'm sure you have ascertained at this point by my character, this is far from the case. Now, it just so happens that my father didn't end up finishing many works while he lived here, but he did finish Our Old Home, which he dedicated to his dear friend, Mr. Franklin Pierce, which was a unpopular move with the transcendentalists of Concord at the time, as due to Pierce's position on slavery. So Mr. Emerson ended up buying Our Old Home out of support of my father, Nathaniel Hawthorne, but cut the dedication page listing Franklin Pierce out in protest of him. Now, it just so happens that one of our last memories together as a family is of reading Evangeline, which is my father's dear friend, Mr. Longfellow's poem. And I had come back from Harvard College one evening to have dinner with my mother and my sisters, and as my father's eyesight at the time was failing, I ended up coming in here, sitting down. I picked up Evangeline just by pure chance and read the poem aloud. My mother and sisters were here as well. And then upon finishing, my mother and sisters got back up and went to finish the dishes. And my father and I ended up sitting here actually for some time in silence. And then I got up and went back to Harvard College. And that is actually one of the last memories that I have of my father. Now, upon his death, we found several manuscripts in his manuscript closet on the way up to the Sky Parlor, such as Dolliver's Romance, which ended up riding on my father's casket to the grave, and Septimius Felton, which is an unfinished work. Now, it is only my hope that I may take some wisdom and ideas from the young men in the history that have come before me here, for the Whitneys in the Revolutionary War, from Frederick Llewellyn Willis at the time of the Alcotts, from Benjamin Thompson and John Winthrop at the time of the Revolutionary War, and then from my stay here and from my father as well. And well, thank you for stopping by today, and I hope I'll see you around town.